This is my first week back from beautiful Jamaica. As you know, I was there for about 10 days with my Engineers Without Borders biodiesel travel team, where we went to close out a project we began in 2008. So even though I'd been with the projects from the beginning, it was my first trip to Jamaica. It was quite beautiful, very lovely, but it reminded me of Taiwan in that it was in the 90 degrees and about 90% humidity. So just standing there, you would begin to sweat. This is our biodiesel team. You can see me here in the middle. And I'm not going to go too much into the trip itself. In fact, I'm still digesting and processing all of the information that we collected and the experiences we had into reports that I will have to turn in next month. So I'll have some more to talk about later. But today what I thought I might do is a bit of a book report. A little bit of a light beach read. Took one book with me and got most of the way through it. Quite a fascinating and dense book, about 400 plus pages of jam-packed information. And if I could just read the quote from the New York Times, they call it ambitious, illuminating, and sexily theoretical. I can attest to that. Indeed, it is quite a monumental book. And it is about information, which is a concept at once easy to understand and yet hard to grasp. So this book is meant to illuminate all of our human history, if you could call it that, of trying to make sense out of randomness, out of chaos, out of communication, and going from just basic word-of-mouth communication to written language to all of the wonderful technology that we currently have. And I hope to condense some of that into this presentation. Because ultimately, our goal here, both in our experiences with the Tao, at least I hope for you in your everyday life, and certainly for James Gleick, the author of this book, is to make sense out of all of this randomness. And one great quote he has towards the end of the book is that a good science theory is economical. Obviously, all of the cultures that we've been studying and all of the wisdom that we've accumulated is because it's been condensed down to the fundamental elements and to cause and effect and categorization. So this, as you may know, is a symbol of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which even predates our own study of the Tao Te Ching. The book begins by outlining all of the ways that we as human beings have been able to try to communicate information over long distances. And it even goes into the minutest of information coding. So with drums in Africa and having a way to contextualize speech and to transmit it over long distances, it took even non-Africans many decades and years to begin to understand that that wasn't just a cultural, let's have a party, but it was actually a form of communication and encoding of language that could be transmitted over hundreds of miles even. And then, of course, going down into the minutest detail, all of that progress of our monumental computation has led us to an understanding of just what it is that makes us ourselves. Even if we don't completely understand it quite yet, we do make great leaps of progress every year, which helps us in many respects, specifically in new medical treatments that may be of use to some of us. We begin also with the book talking about this idea of just moving from the spoken word into a way to transmit information across space and time. And for all of the wonderfulness of the written word, and as that began to emerge, even with the cuneiform, there were people who thought it wasn't such a great idea. From the book I'm reading, one unlikely Luddite, who was also the first long-term beneficiaries, was Plato. He warned that the technology of writing meant impoverishment. Apologize, my computer is acting up. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the mind of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing produced by external characters which are no part of themselves will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir not of memory, but of reminding, and you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. Gleick also says, with words we begin to leave traces behind us, like breadcrumbs, memories and the symbols for others to follow. Ants supply their pheromones, trails of chemical information, and now people, we leave paper trails. Isn't it so true how much paper we tend to generate? Now, communication over long distances has been critical for human beings for quite some time. Us being humans, we have a need for speed. Even from our very beginning, getting out of the bush, standing up, using our two legs to evade predators and chase down prey. From this time forward, we had a need to communicate effectively over long distances, which became even more critical as our culture spread far and wide across our planet. The need to deliver a clear message became even more critical, especially for world leaders and people who were in charge of communities. And so, generally, long-distance communication became very expensive because only those who could afford it could really use it effectively. For thousands of years, the fastest messages were sent by horses or carrier pigeons. In the early 1800s, the telegraph was born, but not the telegraph that you might think of on the right, the one on the left, which was, of course, just coming to use at that time. And the early telegraph, in fact, before there was the electronic one, was invented by a Frenchman named Claude Chappe during the French Revolution. These towers were meant to communicate with other towers in their line of sight by use of these signaling mechanisms where the arms would move into different positions, symbolizing different letters of the alphabet. Previously, such long-distance communication was done by fire, by bonfires, but of course you had to know what that bonfire meant, and there wasn't a whole lot of transmission that was possible with that on-off signal. And then, of course, almost as soon as the telegraph that we see on the left became into broader use around the world by world governments, it became obsolete with the introduction of the electric telegraph around the 1850s. The innovation of this was the use of electrical wires strung across the countryside and the use of this lever mechanism that would produce dashes and dots. A system of representing the alphabet, yet again, another bit of symbolic jujitsu. One of the great things about reading this book is learning about world history and the people who helped make it. On the very left here we see George Babbage. He was a very famous inventor and just general tinkerer and scientist. He invented a machine, a great gleaming giant engine of brass and pewter that was comprised of thousands of cranks and rotors, cogs and gear wheels, all tooled with the utmost precision. He spent his whole life improving it, and first in one incarnation and then another, but always mostly in his mind, never fully coming to fruition. And this was an expense that was levied against the nation of Britain. For many, many years, almost 20 years, he spent trying to build this machine until eventually he was cut off by some government ministers who said, well, what is this for anyway? And what was this great machine for? It wasn't really able to produce anything tangible per se, like a pin or a tapestry. No, what it was meant to produce was numbers, manufacturing of numbers. And why would that have been so important? Well, because numbers and tables of logarithms were able to be used by sailors and by the Navy, and that was one of the great ways that the British Empire was able to expand. Now, in the middle we have Ada Lovelace. She was an amazing woman, a contemporary of Babbage, and she is credited as being one of the most influential and early computer scientists before really there were even computers. Because even though Babbage's machine was meant to generate numbers, it wasn't really meant to do programming per se. It was just you give it a number and it would do the math on itself, not necessarily run into programs outside of doing very simple but high-order math. She said of her process, which she didn't know was at the time now what we would call an algorithm. She says, any process which alters the mutual relation of two or more things, and declared it that this is the most general definition and would include all subjects in the universe. This new science of operation, as she would conceive it, she would go on to say, is a science of itself, and has its own abstract truth and value, just as logic has its own peculiar truth and value, independently of subjects which may apply its reasonings and processes. One main reason why the separate nature of the science of operations has been little felt, and in general little dwelt on, is the shifting meaning of many of the symbols used. And so another expansion on symbolism in terms of trying to get at a higher truth. Sadly, she died out of uterine cancer before she could really reach her apex and give us more of her brilliant mind. Finally, here on the right, we have Alan Turing, who you may know of as the famous mathematician who invented the Turing competition. This is a way for us to test artificial intelligence. We still use it today, and it is quite fanciful. So one of those concepts is to be able to see if one can tell the difference between a computer or a human by just sitting in a room and receiving messages and asking questions. So the Turing test is quite famous, but something that is even more of a great legacy to science and to our generation is Turing's famous computer, which was a machine made of logic. It was completely imaginary, unlike Babbage's one full of cranks and springs and gears. This imaginary machine would consist of the following symbols, or rather the following components: an imaginary tape, arbitrary symbols, and it had all the time in the world an unbounded memory to do almost anything expressible in terms of an operation or steps. So this machine could literally take anything and be able to, with an algorithm, produce anything out of it, depending on what that algorithm was. In the case of that formula that is neither provable nor disprovable, such a machine clearly does not have to behave in a very satisfactory manner for it to continue to work indefinitely without producing any result at all. So in a way, it is the original perpetual motion machine because it needs neither energy nor it expounds any energy to continue doing what it's doing. So these wonderful individuals contributed greatly to our experience of computers even before they themselves could see it in their lifetime. This diagram is a little bit difficult to follow, and I hope I can do it justice. One of the wonderful things that would come out of all of this higher math and trying to understand how to transmit information and compute numbers and do things in a very higher order is the concept of entropy. Entropy first came along in the understanding of thermodynamics. The steam engine specifically was a way for industrial revolution to really expand all of the mighty energy of people. So using that, the study of thermodynamics was greatly expanded, and there's this concept called entropy. But as people were studying computation and symbolism and cryptology, they kept running into the same concept as well. One of the first to really work out the meaning of entropy was a gentleman named Claudius, and he termed it as entropy being the unavailability of energy to be used, or rather its uselessness for work. So for example, take water. If you have a mountain stream, at the top of the mountain we have gravity helping move the water down, and if you were to put a water wheel right there at that stream or that river, that water would move the wheel and create work, and yet in itself it would not lose energy, it would just continue going down the hill. And so that is useful work, and entropy is the opposite of that, if you can imagine. I'll hopefully get back to this concept of entropy here shortly, but out of the concept of entropy we get the two laws of thermodynamics. The first being that the energy of the universe is constant. You may also have heard of it as energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And the second law, that entropy of the universe always increases. So no matter what, we're always trying to reach equilibrium. Water seeks its level. Temperature, you'll either eventually work harder in your body to keep your own temperature up, or if your life passes, your temperature will reach equilibrium without of the room. And entropy can be seen as not so much the unavailability to do work, which indeed it is, but also more the statistical likelihood of moving towards that equilibrium. So granted, this little demon, if he was imaginarily tiny, almost to the size of these atoms in the box, the demon, his job is to reverse entropy. I see that the organizer, meaning I think Derek, is experiencing some difficulties. Hopefully they will be coming back in a moment. Let me continue talking about this little demon while we wait for them to get back. So this little demon is in charge of saying, you know what, no, we're going to keep this box full of gas atoms separated. So the hotter ones are going to go over to the left and the cooler ones are going to go to the right. And he has enough knowledge and information in and of himself, even though he is tiny and does not require any food or energy or computational brain power, yet he still knows which box the two, depending on their velocity, the atoms need to go into. And of course, a lot of people took this very seriously, and in fact, this concept of this little entropy demon was really meant to be a symbol, another way to familiarize ourselves with the concept of entropy, meaning that, yes, statistically it would be possible on a nanoscale to separate, to unwind, to make less complicated systems on their own in and of themselves. But in truth, this little demon does not exist and could not exist and always requires work. So even though the second law cannot be broken, the entropy of the universe is always increasing, we can expect that it can be slowed down, and in fact that is what we're getting towards here in terms of life in itself. So moving on for a moment, this higher math that is comprising a giant chunk of the book, which I am also studying for in general in my academics and my life, in my job, it used to be that early writing, because it took a lot of effort to craft, had to be very useful. And as such, much of the early writing concerns commerce, counting of grain, cattle, maybe slaves. Math was an integral part of this equation. According to Wikipedia, mathematicians seek out patterns and use them to formulate new conjectures. So rather than just adding things up, we start looking at information, how much grain was collected last year versus this year, things like that. As our methods of communication improved, so did our capacity to make sense of the world. And math and science flourished as we had access to other people's work. And yet, as we teased apart the universe's secrets, the tools we had created to decipher nature were still fairly unwieldy. Even with a proper understanding of calculus and higher mathematics, it still takes quite a bit of time and brain power to integrate a polynomial curve. Now we live in a world where it's very likely that the phone in your pocket can compute the square root of a 20-digit number much faster than even Isaac Newton might have, and he was quite a genius, we can agree. So moving on, talking about bandwidth. This book was fascinating because I think I finally got a really good grasp of what a bit actually means. We talk about gigabits and kilobits and things like that, and what comprises the actual information that is being transmitted as I speak here into your wires and to your ears. So as Gleich explains, one bit of information is the amount of information that we need to make a decision between two equally likely alternatives. If we must decide whether a man is less than 6 feet tall or more than 6 feet tall, and if we know that the chances are 50-50, then we need one bit of information. 2 bits of information enable us to decide among 4 equally likely alternatives. 3 bits of information enable us to decide among 8 bits equally likely alternatives, and so on. That is to say, if there are 32 equally likely alternatives, we must make 5 successive binary decisions worth 1 bit each before we know which alternative is correct. So the general rule is simple. Every time the number of alternatives is increased by a factor of 2, 1 bit of information is added. So this marginal number of information has made it so that we can take even all the works of Shakespeare and condense them into ones and zeros and transmit them over a variety of different wires. So here's a picture of some communication wires and how they relate in terms of the information that is able to be processed through them. Apparently we are lost.